is always laughing about my F and my P's. We don't have an F in my alphabet in the Philippines. So sometimes it gets to be a little confusing. If you haven't seen the show, you're missing something. You have last time today, 3 o'clock. They're still selling tickets, but it's packed. It was great. It was just wonderful. The kids were just hilarious. The adults were, believe it or not, funny, talented, and it's really great. And it's a bargain. If you're a senior, it's only $15. And if you're not a senior, it's only $20, and it really makes a big difference. It is really wonderful. I highly recommend it. It's so relaxingly funny. I got home last night, relaxed, and instead of going back to my computer, I went to my TV and watched the show that I love and fell asleep earlier, which is very nice. We would like to welcome Margie. Margie is another person that we have here as our MID member in the sermon. She's working on her being called to be ordained. As we have Chris here, and Margie has been doing programs for our children's messages. He and Chris also does the public supply for preaching. Today, Chris is going to be preaching. Tomorrow is next week is Margie's turn. Margie is not new to our church. When she started coming, she started singing in the choir. Now she doesn't have any more time to sing in the choir, but she can still sing. So I would like to ask and request Margie to open up with a prayer and walk us through love without limits.
Thank you, Velvet. Yes, let us pray. Oh God of infinite love, on this gorgeous Sunday morning, the sun shining, things starting to warm up and the shoots coming, we are reminded of your love every day and your blessings. Help us to take in all we can about it and to share that love as limitlessly as you give it. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So I guess before I get started, because I've had a couple of questions about it, this was very intentional this morning. With the chapters that we had the What's in a Name chapter deals a lot with transgender issues. So this is my transgender pride flag. And then the next chapter on adoption deals with LGBTQ issues. So here's my pride flag. And the last chapter that we have deals a lot with Islam, or deals entirely with Islam. And so, as well as having my Spanish Bible and my Hebrew Bible, I do also have my copy of the Quran. An interesting translation by a woman. It's one of the first Quran translations by women. So I thought, we'll get the diversity and the love on our table also today. So, as I say, the first chapter that we were dealing with is the wearing the wrong name tag. And the names that we are born with, the names that we come to be called by, and whether we like them or not. I happen to love mine, Marjorie. I'm named after my grandmother. Some people does anybody have issues with the names that they have or the names that they have had in the past?
I love my name.
You love your name? Is there significance behind your name?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
But I love it.
Not that there need be. Okay.
And this was made by one of our ladies in church a couple of years ago.
Your name tag?
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I brought it to show you.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. I have had names that I have not enjoyed given to me lovingly. For instance, I have a younger sister. She's only a year and a half younger. We look very, very similar. And growing up, we were very frequently mixed up. And because we're similar size even growing up. But I was always a little bit bigger, a little bit taller, a little bit wider. I was always just a little bit bigger than she was. And somebody had mixed us up in front of my mother. And Mom looked at this person and she said, "Oh, just remember it as Large Marge." And as a middle school kid, that did not go for well for me. She did it totally out of love. She was thinking height. I know she was thinking height. At least that's what I tell myself. But there wasn't anything meant by it, but it didn't come off quite the way she had intended. So we are given names lovingly that don't fit us or that we don't like to hear. And so I thought, ooh, come on. Next. It's thinking, I'm sorry. One of the most common phrases that we hear is "what's in a name," coming right out of Shakespeare. We hear this all the time. How important is a name?
Very important. How do you know you're being talked to or called?
As opposed to just, hey, you?
Your reputation gets tied to it. So, if someone else with a similar name does something horrible and it's like, oh, is that you? And so being misidentified, I know if I call a child in my class the wrong name, not just that child, but the entire class gets deeply offended on their behalf.
Oh.
Like, that is not their name, that's not what they're called. I'm like, I'm so sorry.
I have a story. I had 2 children come to the child care center from some kind of different country. And we would try to get their attention by calling their name. And they were twins, and they would run all over the place. So I asked the mother what she does at home, and she says, oh, I just say, come on, boys.
Okay, I know I'm connected. Hush. I'm sorry. This was working a minute ago. Chris,
do you want to keep talking and I'll try to
That's not what I'm seeing on my computer. I don't. I had a video to show. Oh, it went away. Okay, so I guess.
It'll go back in a second.
I'm sorry?
It'll go back in a second.
Okay. Hey. My thing. Okay. Yay, thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Okay. Yay. Okay, go next one. Yes, all right. Let's show the video. So this is my what's in a name.
My family named me Uza Maka. That's my full name. It means the road is good. Isn't that a beautiful name? Thanks, Mom. I got it for my birthday. Uza Maka. But I grew up in a small New England town. And there weren't a lot of Nigerian Americans living in my region. And I would have teachers or anyone, neighbors, try and say my name, and it would be Azumeka, Uzamaka, Uzakuza, any version that they could think of other than Uzamaka. So I came home from school one day, and my mom was cooking in the kitchen, as she is wont to do, the mother of 5 children. And I said to her, Mommy, can I ask you a question? She said, I said, can you call me Zoe? And she stopped and gave that mother look that only mothers know and have, and said, why? And I said, because no one can say Oza Maka. And she looked at me and she said, if they can learn to say Tchaikovsky and Michelangelo and Dostoevsky, then they can learn to say Oza Maka. And I never asked her again. And what is amazing now, standing in my womanhood, in my power, is I wouldn't change my name for a second. I'm so proud of that name and what stems behind it and what it represents. So do not ever erase those identifiers that are held in you, whether it's your gap, whether it's your name, whether it's your food. It is yours, and it was given to you at birth, and it is yours to own.
I saw that years ago, a couple of years ago, it's not that old. She is one of the actresses in the TV series Orange is the New Black, the HBO series. And that really struck me that, how much meaning a name can have. And it's a lot of what Bussy talks about in her book, with names having that huge, strong attachment and that huge, strong meaning and such power. We have in, she talks a lot about transgendered individuals and how they, how strong an attachment a name is for them, having been married to an individual who was transgendered. I went through the name change process with him, and that was such a big deal to be known as who he felt he should have always been known. So a name holds a huge amount of power. And there's a quote from Martin Luther that says, Christians are called to call things by their right name. We do focus a lot on names in some cases. Are there some things in today's society that you feel we do or do not call by their right name? What are some examples of things that maybe we don't call by their right name? Anybody?
All the horrible words for LGBT people.
Okay.
I work in a community in Brentwood, and when they call immigrants outsiders, it breaks my heart because they're people, and I'm their teacher, so I see them as people. And
Yes.
we're all immigrants here, so.
I have a thing on that in a minute, so thank you.
When hate crimes performed by white people are not called terrorist attacks.
Ooh, amen.
I've heard any of those stories.
You're all over all those.
No, I don't know what they said.
Oh, okay. We had slang terms for LGBTQ people. And then immigrants being called outsiders instead of an us. And Serena's was white hate crimes not being called terrorism. So those are all things we don't name appropriately. We do have things that we do rename. We rename them in light of political correctness. For instance, and I hate to use these terms, but I need them for the example, you don't use retarded anymore, because that's not the appropriate language to use. We use, we have a host of other names, other terms, mentally challenged, things like this, differently abled. And they're names that people would like to be called. Those are their identifiers rather than to be termed something that's not nice or looked down on. And so there is an element of respecting that. What I'm curious about, though, I got thinking about it, we've got politically correct, and politically correct, or the names that people want to be called, are terribly important. But where is the line? Okay, I'm sorry. So Bussy at one point, she said, to love is to listen. Often what we misname political correctness is simply a person requesting that we call them by the name they or God have chosen for themselves. This is how they empower themselves. This is how they identify themselves. And as Martin Luther said, why would we not call them what they should be called? And I use they just because I don't like an us they, but I use it just to identify the different strata, I guess. But I think there's a fine line between political correctness and euphemisms, because so often we couch, for instance, Serena's bringing not calling something what it should be called to make us feel better. You know, couching hate crimes and not calling it domestic terrorism as maybe it should be. Is that a euphemism to make ourselves feel better that it isn't as bad as maybe it is? Or maybe not calling something a hate crime that should be called a hate crime? Is there something we can think of that, I'm not even sure. Does anybody have thoughts on that? I don't know that there is a right answer. Chris?
So here's one that's a little more lighthearted, but
Okay, yes, go for it.
Calling it right-sizing instead of downsizing. It's a way that a lot of businesses use to couch, laying people off in a more positive term.
Right? Just something exactly like that. Melva, did you?
Coming to America in the early 70s, I started working in a company, and they always say, "Oh, she's a WASP," and I had no clue what it meant. And and so eventually I stopped. I asked, "What do you mean? What does it mean?" And so they told me. And only just about a few days ago, I saw the name again, and I said, it reminded me of how people brand people. And it was not a nice feeling. And when I saw that word again, I said, that's exactly what it meant, what we're doing right now, what we're studying.
Mm-hmm.
How could you love somebody and then call them names?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to admit, when I started reading the book, I had two thoughts. One was, do I want to sit and read a whole bunch of stories about people that she knows, that Bussy knows, that I don't know? And I'm thinking, are we going to have enough to base forums off of with just these stories? But she added a lot of scripture depth and a bunch of different ways to look at things, or things that caught me that I hadn't been aware of before. And so I thought that was really cool. One of them was this next quote from the book. It's in this same chapter, on the chapter of names, and it's, if you are a Christian, what does it mean to learn that the quote was that Abraham and Sarah were the first immigrants. In Hebrew, wait, here we go. In Hebrew, the term for Hebrew is, the word Hebrew, this is on page 58 if anybody wants to follow. The word Hebrew, ivrit, comes from a root meaning to cross over a boundary. The word thus means resident in a foreign land. In other words, Hebrew means immigrant. Abraham and Sarah were the first immigrants, the first resident aliens. And she finishes that with, we are born to cross boundaries. And I just thought that was the coolest thing in light of all that is happening right now. And so what does it mean to learn that the mother and father of the Christian faith, Sarah and Abraham, were immigrants? And how should the church treat immigrants? How should we respond as God's people to the refugee crisis? And that's a big deal, because that's a lot going on right now. So knowing that we are born to be immigrants and we are born to travel and cross borders, what are your thoughts on what we're doing, how versus what maybe we should be doing or should not be doing? I know it's a little bit of a heavy topic for first thing in the morning.
Well, first of all, immigrants are people. If we're to love, as Christ says, we're to love all people. Therefore, they should be treated with respect. Second of all, we actually need the immigrants that are coming across the border, because we have places where that kind of work needs to be done.
Okay.
If the process was not, because I work very closely with this community, if the process were not as expensive and lengthy as it is, it would be easier for them to obtain the documents and the citizenship that they need. But sometimes they have to choose between feeding their family or paying an attorney. And they're good people. The majority of them are here working jobs that we don't want. and I'm cleaning and cooking and doing work for less than minimum wage, and they are family-oriented people. Unfortunately, the process is so lengthy and expensive, and it takes them a long time to become a citizen. But I work very closely. All my students are immigrants, every single one, and the weight of the weight of them on their shoulders is huge, because they know they need to make their family better. And the other day we were using the word "because" to write a sentence, and one of my boys wrote, "I need to get my visa because I need to bring my family here." This is a 9-year-old. So you see it differently when you work very closely. Sorry, you see my voice.
No, I'm right there with you.
When you talk to the children, you get a different perspective.
Yeah.
What is portrayed on the news. When you see what they've gone through to get here, which is not a pretty journey, you see the other side of the coin.
Okay, thank you.
I also work, I work at a Head Start in Manhattan, and the majority of my students came here from Mexico or Central America, and it's a mixture of some were documented, some of the children were born here, some of their parents are not documented. But one of the moms in my class came here when she was 1 or 2. You know, she sounds American, but she is not a citizen. And so like she would love to go to college, she would love to do these things, but she doesn't have these papers, and she's this very driven, intelligent young woman who is trying to raise her son, but it's like, this is my home, this is where I've lived. And you know, as you said, they work so hard. Like I've never had parents as dedicated as these parents.
Right.
Who do anything for their children. Like they come, they take the English classes, they want to learn how to, take our nutrition classes. They are so involved. If you need volunteers, they're the first ones to sign up. So I think it proves, when you know people, it really changes what you see.
Yeah. Melva and hang on, Mary. I'm trying to catch an order.
All of a sudden blank. I was so busy. I was so absorbed listening to Serena. You and Margie went to Nicaragua several times, and we saw the deplorable condition of the people. We put together programs, and it helped for the churches. And the most recent email, which I just passed on to my global commission, was an email from Sonia, and she said, the sewing project that we started has to be closed because people are choosing what to buy. They only buy necessity. Right now they have a very volatile condition, unrest in Nicaragua. It is so dangerous. Young people are being taken from the villages, outright murder or never be seen again. And so she said, most of the people now are leaving the country. And so the people that are there at the border are the same people that we have met when we were in Nicaragua. They are intelligent, they're knowledgeable of what they're doing, everything. And when some other people would talk about them, like they're non-existent, it hurts because you were there, I was there, and we knew and we know how it feels.
Yep.
So this is how it is so difficult to say, you have to love somebody, you have to love without limit, and yet there is a certain area where you'd say, how much?
Yeah, how much can I do, how much can I give?
Yes.
Mary?
If we believe in families, then why are we separating children from parents, and even a nursing child from a mother? There's absolutely nothing Christian about separating families. And the other thing I'd like to say is there's racism in all of this, and the racism affects things in such a way. I'm going to tell you something that racism has done. Children that were born where I was working were not given a name immediately. They were given a substitute name and not named until later, till they saw whether they were going to make it through or not.
Right.
And the substitute name would be something like, why did you come late? Or why did you give me such a hard time?
Really?
Describing the labor or describing the danger, or you are bringing a lots of danger to the family, anything that's going on at the time. And then maybe 6 months later, if that child was still alive, they might think about a name.
Interesting. All right. In my household, as you saw in the photo, my partner is Chinese, from Hong Kong. And so she's an immigrant also. And when the latest immigrant crisis started going down, because this is not a new topic, this is something that's been going on for umpteen years. I mean, really since the country came into being, this has been an issue. From one group to another. I mean, the initial group just took over. The Irish started coming, and it was, no, we can't have the Irish. And, well, I wouldn't be here without that immigration. And then the Italians, and then, you know, one right after another. So this is not a new issue. It's just the latest wave of it. And we watch very carefully because it does affect us. My partner is a citizen, but that was one of the first things my mother asked me when we started really getting underway with the immigration issues this round. She said, "How's Eva? Is she, you know?" I said, "Yes, we're all good. We're not in question." But it is a concern for so many families that, you know, people that all their lives have been here, all of a sudden are no longer here. So we're not going to solve that issue in this room, but it is something I wanted to bring up. In this, I know there is a lot of this book. This was my other thought when I first read the book. It's kind of preaching to the choir. We know we need to love. We know we need a huge love. That's what God calls us to do. That's what Jesus taught us to do. So some of what I wanted to look at are maybe what action items we can take to show that love, because we know we need to do it. But maybe something we always said in the Commission on the Global Church, one of our Nicaraguan partners said, "Show us love just by walking with us, just by being with us." But my question was always, well, what does that look like? You know, that's great to say, and I'm all for it, but what does that look like? What does this love without limits look like? But we are somewhat short on time, so I wanted to keep going a little bit. Our next chapter is on adoption, and it started out with the story of two parents who were willing to take any child they could get because they couldn't have one on their own. They would take any race, they would take disability or no disability or differently abled, depending on how you want to call it. You know, they were willing to take any child they could get because they had love to give. They did get a child, but the child was born with fetal alcohol syndrome to a mother who was in prison and addicted to cocaine, so the baby was born addicted also, and the child had a very, very tough beginning of life. But these two parents loved this kid unconditionally. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And then she said, after all of this, and she gave a male and female name to this couple, but after the whole thing, after everybody's sitting here saying, "Oh, what great parents they are," she said, "Well, actually, it's two men that adopted this child. Do you still feel these are great parents?" Coming from my social location, I'm like, well, that doesn't change a thing. And I know that's how a lot of people feel. But there are some that would sit here and say, "Oh no, that's a problem. We can't do that." So we look at the Bible, and we look towards the Bible as our guide for things like this also, as do many, many other people in the world. And we arrive at totally opposite conclusions. I have a nephew who is totally against anything LGBTQ related and knows that I am sinning on a regular basis just for being gay. So that's how the Bible informs him, and he will proof text me. He will read me chapter and verse as to why I'm wrong. And I sit here and say, "You're young, you'll get over it." Well, I mean, not to him, because that's not that, but I mean, in my mind, that's what I'm hoping. And we do actually have discussion about it, because I don't agree with his views, and my Bible tells me otherwise, that we are all loved. So how does the Bible guide your conduct in sexual ethics or in politics? Because both of those are huge issues in life right now. How does the Bible guide it for you? Because, as I say, you can get You know, for me and my nephew, the Bible guides us in way different directions. Anybody? Don't all jump at once.
We shoot the questions ahead of time so that we can.
Okay, I'll try and pop them ahead of time. Chris.
I'm going to quote one of my favorite professors from seminary, who was this cantankerous Nigerian woman who, by her own admission, did not really like teaching. She was more of a clinician, and she was a psychologist in addition to a professor of theology. And so she taught this class on marriage and the family, and she's like, you know, when I grew up, my grandfather had, he had like 5 wives, and there were like 100 grandchildren floating around. So I have a very different view of this. And she goes, you know what Jesus says about these passages? He says, hey buddy, we don't do that upstairs. Things like, because she would say, the Pharisees asked Jesus, the woman has a husband and he dies, and she marries another one and he dies. Whose wife is she in heaven? And Jesus' response is, nobody's. Joke's on you. We don't do that. And then we have the politics, but at the end of the day, we call Jesus our king, and that's a very different king from King Henry or any of the earthly kings we've known. So there is a sense throughout Scripture that all of these things are kind of temporary and ad hoc and not necessarily the final things that we need to obsess over.
I might use that at some point.
That's Rabbi Gelman's article today in Newsday.
Oh, cool.
That when we get into heaven, it doesn't matter what our religious beliefs are.
Uh-huh.
We're all at the table together.
Amen to that.
I think also the Bible was written in such different contexts of people and life and the challenges they faced and otherwise. And it's sometimes difficult for us to try and apply that language to our problems. I mean, if my cell phone is broken, that is a calamity. That is not something that was kind of conceptually or emotionally or otherwise there. And I think we read modern complexity and nuances of words and all the other pieces to a message that in very fundamental ways is pretty simple. It's an incredibly hard set of messages, right? But they're not as complex as we make them. When we have politically correct language and not correct language, and when we have every nuance and specificity for every situation, all those are categorizing and making things very specific in a way that, you just sit there and say, oh, come on, what's right? And that's something that there's a pretty good agreement to people if you didn't give them a legal, competitive, argumentative version of the world, but you put them in a hypothetical situation. I think most people would agree. So I think a lot of people, me included, because of the context of where I live, use the Bible for our own agendas instead of stepping back and saying, what's the message here? What is it about? And that's very hard to do for us.
Yes, it is. And actually, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that how many times in the Old Testament you hear, you once were a stranger in a foreign land, and how many times you hear, love your neighbor.
Yep.
And how to reconcile those two.
Yeah.
In addition to that, and for me, almost foremost, is the life that Jesus lived. His attitude when he met somebody in need. He didn't ask what country they came from.
Yep. And in the next chapter, along with that, Bussy talks about the Good Samaritan and how the Samaritan was somebody from a different religion. And it was the rival religion of the Jews. And how Jesus was using that, he was using that to talk about the religious aspect of things, but that nobody stopped to say, what religion are you as they're getting through on all this, or who are you, where are you from? So yeah, and you all led me right into the next one, which is Bussy's use of the term selective literalism. Selective literalism meaning you take certain parts of the Bible literally, but others metaphorically, and you choose which ones you're going to use. I always use the term cherry picking. And that who here knows of somebody who is selectively literalist or is themselves? And I will be the first to raise my hand.
Your nephew now.
My nephew. You were saying something? I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, people I had to go to school with when I was taking nursing,
Okay.
Bible Presbyterians.
Okay. I will admit I am. Because there are parts of it that I look at and go, yes, that's what, Jesus said, love everyone, love your neighbor. There we go, that's absolutely. Jesus also said, give everything you have if you want, and make yourself poor, give it all to your neighbors so that you can follow me. And I'm thinking, do I have to give everything up? So, yeah, Alice.
I think we're all selective living.
I absolutely agree. I think there are things that are easier to be done, and so we say, okay, these things, yes, absolutely. These things, well, maybe that did mean something a little bit different. And I don't know that that's necessarily a horrible thing, but I do think we need to be aware of the fact, I am aware that I do take some things literally versus others that somebody else will take literally and I will not. For instance, Paul's teaching of, gay people are sinful. That's not exactly what he said, and I look at it as something different because I look at the context behind it, but somebody else will take that literally and say that's exactly what he meant. So, were you stretching or did you, okay. So I think we all are selectively literal at different times, and to just be aware of the fact that we are. Maybe there are some who are not, and I'm not going to judge one way or another whether you feel you are or not. But it is something to keep in mind. Because I'm running short on time, I'm not going to get into the 5-10 minutes I wanted to take. Sorry.
That's okay. You still have 16 minutes,
Yeah, but I have a couple other slides I want to get through. So, Bussy had an activity in her book about what she does with her classes, and she has them all write a 6-word memoir of themselves, and you can only use 6 words to describe yourself. And if you only had those 6 words, just take a moment or two to think, what 6 words would you use to describe yourself, your life, your journey? I would have loved to have tried to have written them down and then said, ooh, it belongs to this one. But it's worth it to stop and think for a few minutes. What words would you use to describe yourself? It also goes back to the what's in a name. That, those words hold power for you and hold meaning for you. And are there some words that you would use in your memoir that you really don't really want to use in your memoir? And are there things you would like to change about that? And to really think and make yourself aware of what names you ascribe to yourself and whether you love them or would like to change them into something you do love. And then I have another video. This one's one of my favorites.
Margie?
Yes.
There was a book, 6-word memoirs, and it's packed with the funniest
Oh,
things
really?
that you came up with. You have to find this book. It's
Okay.
hysterical. I mean, there are all kinds of ones that are just plain for fun, and others very serious with what they wrote in the 6 words.
Sure.
But one that, every time someone has a baby, they always laugh when I tell them this. I think it said, carnivore marries vegetarian, and they beget, herbivore. Yeah, it's a carnivore weds omnivore, and beget, not omnivore, omnivore's a punchline, hold on a second. You know what I'm saying, herbivore marries carnivore, and they beget omnivore.
That's great, I like that.
The whole book, from every angle, so everybody should find that book.
All right.
It's so much fun to read.
I will definitely look that one up. And I'm paused again. It doesn't like my videos. This is another love video. and it's based on a commercial, or it is a commercial that was around a few years ago. All right, while that thinks, after the video, we're going to jump to the last chapter that we have for today, chapter 6, which is about Islam and the danger of the single story. And I think it was a very important chapter because, yes, it dealt a lot with Islam and the fact, and her different friends. And when she put this book together, she, as Lynn was telling last week, she put the book together, and before she finished it, she had shopped it out to a publisher. Publisher said, I love the idea, I want the book, gave her the advance. She wrote the book, gave it to them, and they said, great book, except chapters 5, which are, chapter 5, which is the LGBTQ chapter, and chapter 6, which is the Muslim chapter, have to go. That they felt they did not go with what they felt Christianity should be learning about love. And Bussy said, yeah, now you're limiting our love, so no, I'm not doing it, here's your money back, I'll go find another publisher elsewhere. She did find another publisher, we're going to do this again. She did find another publisher, fortunately, that let her keep all of her chapters in. So we just finished one of the controversial chapters, and we're about to get into the other one. Because due to this single story, people tend to have a fear of Islam or misconceptions about Islam or feel it is not appropriate for us to be talking about. I apologize.
It's not your fault. The technology isn't working.
It was working before.
Blame Bill Gates.
Yeah, right? I used to use a Mac.
That's a great picture.
Thank you. That was this fall. We were up wandering. Get to see all the stuff I have on my computer.
Margie, last year during our women's event for the New York State, we invited Muslim women for a program, and there were 6 of them who came, all professionals. So we were taking pictures for our publicity and everything. And we asked permission if we could do it. They said, yes, you could, but you cannot publish them, because they were so much in fear when people would see what they're doing and what they are and where they are. And so each day our Islamic friends and brothers and sisters, I call them our Islamic siblings, are always in fear of a danger of what would happen. And that takes me back to New Zealand, that happened last week.
Yes, okay. Yeah, definitely. It totally takes us to what's been going on. Current slide. Go, go, go. Hot dog. Okay. Before we get too much further in, I want to share this. Please.
There it is.
Go back. Play. It's my favorite
Wait,
video.
somebody's coming, it was like a cartoon?
No, the cartoon's something different. Let me pull it up on the internet real fast.
And this is exactly what Paul meant when we are in a different situation than the people at the olden times in the Bible.
Right? Oh, I lost internet connectivity, it looks like. No, okay, so we don't do that video today. So the video was it just showed an x-ray machine, and it was this huge giant x-ray, and you saw 2 people embracing in just skeletal form. And after this skeletal form, there's That's the, all right, fine. You just saw the skeletal form of these two people embracing. And then there's this crowd around this huge giant screen watching this, and everybody's oohing and eyeing over it. And then each of them come out from either side of it, and they're both women. But you don't know that because it's just skeletons. And then you see two other skeletons embracing. And come out, and it's a man and woman. She's African American, he's Asian. And they come out in front and embrace, and a lot more oohing and eyeing. And then you see two kid skeletons, and they come out, and one's a girl with Down syndrome, and the other is a girl who doesn't have it. And every time they come out in front, there's a little box at the bottom of this screen that says "Love has no," and for the two women it was "Love has no gender." For the interracial couple it was "Love has no race." For the two little girls, it was "Love has no disability." And the reason I thought this one was so perfect for this is because the next one was of, there were three people, and two tall people and a kid in this, of the skeletons. And they come out from around, and it's two men and their son. And I thought, oh, with Elijah, that was the perfect thing. And then you see a Chinese and a Hindu woman. You see a Jew and a Muslim. You see all different variations of people, and not necessarily romantic couples, all of them, but some of them were just friendships. It's a very touching, it was a commercial. It was from the Ad Council that they were running. They had a whole series of them 4 or 5 years ago. And just very moving commercials to me. And so I always watch them and get choked up by the end of it because I just think it's the greatest thing ever. But that's where I was going with this, but I lost my internet connection, so I'll have to show it another time. So with the, I give up. With the story on Islam and the danger of the single story, is there some group or some group, because this is all about groups, the single story being you hear one thing about a group of people, and so you have this impression of, or you might hear several things, but they're not good things. You have an impression of a group of people, and it's not a flattering impression, but you don't know that this is not who they are because this is the only story you're hearing. And so when you get to actually know somebody, then all of a sudden that story changes. And she tells of that she knew of she had one impression of Muslims for a period of time. And then she actually met somebody and she said, oh, but you actually do that? Or she had a friend in college. He was her first Muslim friend. She was riding home to Florida. He had offered to drive her home to Florida. And she had always heard, as a Christian, as a very conservative Christian, that Muslims are not good. They're the terrorists and this, that, and the other thing. And then he offered to drive her home for one, so she could see her mother on Christmas break. But then as they're driving home, she was flipping stations on the radio, and they hit a contemporary Christian station, and some Jesus song came on, and she quickly flipped the station. And he said, well, why did you do that? And she said, well, I didn't figure you wanted to listen to that music. And he said, oh no, I love that song. And she flipped it back, and they sang along to it. Making the point that, she then went on to make the point about how much Islam talks about Jesus and acknowledges Jesus coming, born of the Virgin. The big difference is they don't feel he was divine. So what are groups of people that we hear a single story about, that we don't necessarily catch the entire rest of the story?
Pick one. I think people have that about football players or lacrosse players. They're all obnoxious, privileged boys, and Melva sent us to a TED Talk called The Single Story, which was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And
I was going to play some of that today. That's not happening. So the whole thing froze up on me again. Okay, so yes, absolutely.
I think it was Betty Lamar, but she was considered the most beautiful woman of her time, this amazing screen star, and she also helped develop all of these inventions in computers, and was brilliant. Or like now currently on the Big Bang Theory, how one of the actresses, they're like, well, is it hard to talk about calculus? And she's like, well, I actually have a PhD in like
Maya
neuro. Yeah. So it's like, no, not really.
Yeah, right? Yes.
There's an answer in some respects to this bit of giving other groups a single, a single message from, and that is actually listening to them, making the time to listen seriously and without speaking to them, and change their mind.
It goes back to that listen piece that we were talking about before.
Many people are accused of a crime, and it's in the papers,
Okay?
and that's the only thing you know.
Yep. Okay. We do that a lot, I think.
Francie and I went to a Broadway show called The Prom last night, which is about a lesbian girl who has issues with the prom and all. And it was very good in affirming an LGBTQ. But one thing in there was a portrayal of fundamentalist Christians that was so stereotypical, even though the message was trying to move forward and past this, its portrayal of the fundamentalist was really incredibly prejudiced. And so in the context of something trying to move in the right direction, there was a lot of hidden secular hatred to fundamentalist Christians, which was interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. I totally lost my train of thought in. So we do have this danger of just knowing one thing about a group of people and not looking further into it. And we hear it about everybody, and I have to admit, I have that issue with the fundamental Christian one because I know of a number that are very, this is it, and do spread as much not love as they do spread love, which bothers me to the extreme. But I do also have to pay attention to the people I do meet are great people.
The very first woman I taught with when I was right out of college, lovely, lovely woman. We got along great. She has 2 young children. And one day we're on the playground, and she mentioned how her children go to a Christian school, so they'll never read those evil Harry Potter books.
Oh no!
And I loved this woman. She was so excited that my husband was in seminary, and we had never really talked in depth about our theology and our beliefs. But we're just like, wait, you're one of those people. But I hate those people, but I love you. But how can you think this about Harry Potter? And this huge conflict in my brain of she was one of them,
right?
But I loved her,
right?
And I never got a chance to really talk to her about it because we had to continue watching the 23-year-olds under our belt. But it was I went home and I was very troubled.
Right? I have a friend, the first thing I ever learned about Islam, actually, was from a friend of mine. I lived in Argentina for a year. She was from Iraq. So her family was Islamic. And not terribly practicing, but it was there. That's who they were. And so she taught me a little bit about Islam. We didn't get into huge religious discussions, but I remember her saying very clearly to me, and Jacqueline Bussey repeats this in her book, and I just thought it was very neat because I hadn't ever had anybody back this up before. But Layla told me that of the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism was the first faith. God essentially gave people Judaism to bring people closer to God. And then Christianity came along and picked up those that Judaism left behind, because we are a combination of the Jews and the Gentiles and other groups that came into Christianity. So the Christianity came in to pick up those that Judaism left behind. And then you come to Islam, and they were the ones picking up those that the first two groups didn't catch. And it's all a way to get ourselves closer to God, because God is the ultimate in this case. And Bussy said something very similar to that in her book, and I thought that was the coolest thing, because that was the first thing I learned about Islam. Was there something in this chapter about Islam that you learned that you did not know before? Just out of curiosity. Okay, we all know something about Islam then. One of the other, the danger of the single story, one of the other things in this that I thought was really cool, or really eye-opening, I guess. Didn't want to start there. Down. There we go.
Margie.
Yes. Am I close
Going
to
back
time?
to single stories, there are, you still have a little
Okay.
minutes. There were 3 vocabularies that I'm looking at this. It says assumption,
Mm-hmm.
prejudice,
Yep.
discrimination. Because here you only see one side.
Sure.
You do not see the whole picture.
Yes, and they lead to or come out of all of those.
Mhm.
Absolutely. This I thought was the coolest,
Yeah.
the coolest comic. Maybe one of the most eye-opening things in the book for me is that this is totally how I have in the past looked at people walking around in burqas. You know, how horrible that, in the past, how horrible that they're required to do this. And yet they're looking at some going, how horrible that they're required to do this. That was really eye-opening for me. I really enjoyed that. So I took a photo of it and pulled it right out of the book. I thought that was very interesting.
Do you think that Islam is not a male-dominated culture? Are we wrong to think it is?
According to the Quran, no, it is not male-dominated. But according to the cultures that practice it, some are. And some Islamic groups are way more female-oriented than we are, in fact. I mean, how many Islamic countries, not all of them obviously, have had women leaders over the years? Prime ministers and whatnot.
Well, when was it that we went to the last time we went to the Islamic temple? We actually saw the prayer service,
Mm-hmm.
all men.
Okay.
The reason is they're separated. The women are in one group, the male are in the other.
In
And
some.
Yes, it's saying that it's not really male-dominated. I just mentioned the Islamic women that we invited. There were 6 of them, and I mentioned professionals. We have doctors, we have biochemists and everything, and they explained that in the true Quran, the true religion, everybody is expected to be educated and improve themselves, men and women, and they don't just say, oh, the man is the only one who's going to do this.
Right.
So there are some, I call it temple, wherein you can see the women are so dominant.
Right. Well, in the Quran, Mary is talked about more than the Virgin Mary was talked about more than in the Bible. And they totally revere Mary for bringing Jesus, who they just see as a prophet, but who they feel is very, very important in the Islamic faith, was the Virgin Mary. Yes.
From my understanding, kind of like Christianity or Judaism, there's a whole range. So, like in
Right.
Judaism, there are things where they're heavily male-dominated, but then there are also synagogues where they're led by women, and very
I got to dance with a Torah one time in a temple,
yeah.
so
and that's
that
true
was
of Christianity too.
exactly.
When I was growing up, I didn't realize that it was not always typical for women to be pastors, because my church just had lots of women pastors,
Right.
and people openly talked about how, oh yeah, I'm gay and I want to be a pastor one day. I was like, oh sure, why not? And then I got to college and people were like, well, women can't be pastors. I was like, what are you talking about?
Right. You're right. You have the spectrum in all of them. And I know I've got time, but I think I connected to the internet and I really want to show this.
I can see that.
We're good. Okay.